Dr. James White has recently taken a lot of heat for his opinion that St. Ignatius of Antioch may not even have existed. In this video, I want to look at the time that Dr. James White came after me for suggesting that St. Ignatius of Antioch was Catholic, and it's difficult to remain Protestant once you know who he is. So we're going to look at that today, and then in the end, you can decide who you think is more persuasive, James White or Ignatius of Antioch. So this is the tweet that I am talking about, and keep in mind, this happened before the debate and before James White suggested that Ignatius of Antioch didn't even exist. This is what I said: remaining Protestant is very difficult once you know who St. Ignatius of Antioch is. And I think that's true. And I was actually amazed by the comments to this tweet. Dozens of people commented and said, "I read Ignatius, I became Catholic. I read Ignatius, I became Catholic." Literally dozens of people were saying this. And I think Dr. James White felt the need to step in and to try to defend the Protestant position. A friend of mine, Mike Pantile, said, "This is precisely who red-pilled me on Catholicism. Reading his epistles and praying the rosary were a 1-2 punch in my reversion." This person said, "Same." And that person said, "You're susceptible to following cults." Got it. Jerome said, "That's what did it for me, 5-minute conversion." So for somebody like Jerome, reading Ignatius of Antioch was so persuasive that it took him 5 minutes to realize how Catholic the 2nd century church was and to convert. And then Gabriel Hughes also commented and said much of what is attributed to Ignatius of Antioch was probably not written by Ignatius of Antioch. And I'll address that here in just a second. All right, so that's what happened. I tweet that tweet, and dozens of Catholics, dozens of converts say, "Yeah, I read Ignatius and I converted." And then the Protestants have to get involved. And what you'll notice is they basically make 2 objections. They say, one, Ignatius of Antioch isn't who you think he is, or he just didn't mean what it looks like he meant. Whenever he said that the Eucharist is the flesh of Jesus Christ, which we're going to look at, whenever he said that, he didn't really mean it. He meant something else, and you're just reading transubstantiation backwards in time in order to fit your theology. That's one objection. The other objection that they make is they have to say all of his letters are spurious. They have to say he didn't really write the letter to the Romans. That was written in the 11th century by some people who wanted to back up Catholic theology. He didn't really write those letters. That's the other objection. So they can't really argue with what he says directly. They have to either say he didn't mean what he said, or he didn't say what he meant, or they have to say that he didn't even write those letters. But there's real problems with both of those. So let's take a look now at what James White said whenever he responded to this tweet. This is what he says: "I've taught Ignatius in a graduate course in the development of patristic theology, memorized key sections of his letters, recognized the abuse of him by Roman Catholics 1500 years after he lived, especially in reference to his anti-Gnostic comments about the Eucharist they hijack into an anachronistic argument for transubstantiation, and smiled to recognize his letter to the Romans shows there was no pope, not even a single bishop, in Rome in his days. So I know who he was, love reading his words, and know without a doubt that he did not believe what you believe dogmatically today as a Roman Catholic." So notice what he does here. He can't say that Ignatius of Antioch's words don't seem Catholic. He can't say that whenever Ignatius of Antioch says that the Eucharist is the flesh of Christ, which died and rose for us, he can't say that doesn't seem 100% Catholic. Instead, what he has to do is, and it's funny he brings Gnostics up, but instead what he has to do is say, "I know Ignatius of Antioch very well. Therefore, I know what he actually meant." Even though his words seem like they're Catholic, even though Ignatius of Antioch says that the church in Rome presides in love, even though Ignatius of Antioch says that the bread of God is the Eucharist, even though Ignatius of Antioch says that the flesh of Christ which died and rose for us is the Eucharist and that heretics abstain from it, even though he says those things that seem Catholic, I've studied him. In fact, I've taught him in a graduate course. Therefore, I know what he actually meant. And I don't mean to belittle James White, and I'm sure he probably knows these letters much better than I do, and he probably knows the historical criticism and the evolution or whatever. I'm sure he just knows the history better than me. But the point is that these letters, at their plain face value make people Catholic. They do. They were written in the 2nd century, early 2nd century, by a man who was appointed to be a bishop by the apostles. A man who was the disciple of Saint John the Apostle. His words, just read in a simple sense, make people Catholic. Why is that the case? Well, if you're Catholic, it's easy to understand why. It's because you realize St. Ignatius was a Catholic bishop, and he's writing to instruct and to exhort certain churches to be faithful to the apostolic teaching, which includes submitting to your bishop, believing that the Eucharist is the flesh of Christ, and believing that the church in Rome presides in love. It's difficult. It's really difficult to imagine something being more clear. And I want you guys to go through after this and just read his letters. Read his letters. Interpret them for yourselves. What is he saying? It's difficult. It's so difficult to read the letters and say that it was written by anybody other than a faithful Catholic bishop. If I wanted to go back and forge letters that proved the papacy, the Eucharist, and the necessity of the episcopate, I could not forge a letter that has more strong language in proving those things. I think that's probably one of the reasons that people like to suggest that Ignatius of Antioch's letters are forged. It's because there's such strong apologies for the Eucharist, the papacy, and the episcopacy. If you read it, you just read it at its plain face value, you end up Catholic at least 50% of the time. James White also makes a claim that there's no bishop in Rome whenever these letters were written. I have no idea how he's getting that conclusion. I have absolutely no idea. If you read the letter to the Romans, it talks about how Ignatius of Antioch is addressing the church that presides in love, the presiding church, the church that envies no one but has taught others. There's no mention of there being bishops or not being bishops. The letter is addressed to the church in general. So just because Ignatius of Antioch doesn't address a specific bishop doesn't mean that there's not a bishop. All that it means is that Ignatius of Antioch, for whatever reason, thought it was best not to include the name of the bishop or the bishops in Rome at that time. So Ignatius of Antioch, perhaps recognizing that he was going to Rome to be martyred because he was a Christian bishop, didn't feel like it was prudent to include the name, the identity of the Christian bishop of Rome in his letter. Think about if that letter had been intercepted. Ignatius's letter gets taken, and it's probably being proofread by Roman guards before it gets sent off because he was a Roman prisoner at the time he was writing this. And if he had just said, to Alexander, my brother bishop, the bishop of Rome, who now presides in Rome. Okay, well, you just gave away the identity of a pope who they're trying to kill. So maybe it's the smart idea not to include the name of the pope, not to include the name of the bishop. So perhaps that's what Ignatius was doing. I'm not saying for sure that's what he was doing, but I'm just saying that the fact that the name of a bishop of Rome is not included in this letter doesn't mean that there was no bishop of Rome. It doesn't mean that at all. And then I responded by inviting him onto my YouTube channel to discuss this. Yeah, I don't think he'll take me up on that offer. So here's the point of all of this. If you're going to be Protestant and read the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, you have to either say that he didn't mean what he said, or he didn't say what he meant, or just throw doubt upon the fact that he even wrote 7 letters. And there are some letters of Ignatius that are spurious, but the 7 letters that basically every scholar considers authentic now include his letter to the Romans and his letter to the Smyrnans. If you just look at the history of these letters, they're mentioned by Polycarp, Irenaeus, Origen, Eusebius. You just look at the church fathers and they all recognize these 7 letters of St. Ignatius as being authentic. And modern scholarship has actually completely vindicated this. There's really no modern scholars anymore who doubt the authenticity of the 7 letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. So if you're a Protestant and you're watching this, I encourage you, read St. Ignatius's letters, especially to the Romans and to the Smyrnans. It'll take you 15 minutes. They're not very long. And see for yourself. You decide for yourself if these letters are Catholic or not. I'll put the link to those letters in the description, and if you want to see me talking about St. Ignatius of Antioch, how Catholic he is, and how universally recognized he is by the early church, then click on this video next. God bless.